Welcome to Lecture 2. This lecture is about research being a process. The reason research is considered a process is there are several steps when we do research which are both transparent and they're essential to both qualitative and quantitative research. All research, regardless of whether it's qualitative or quantitative, requires precision and effort on part of the researcher. There are three phases in the research process. In the first phase, what must occur is that an issue must be clarified and a method must be chosen. Phase 5 has 5 steps. Of particular importance in this phase is the construction and formulation of a focused research question that shows some kind of an empirical relationship between two concepts, or some kind of relationship between the concept. Phase 2 typically is data collection and organization of the data and organization of literature and all of those steps. And finally, phase 3 is where all the analysis is done and all the results are related to the research question and we draw conclusions. What we have to remember is each of these phases have multiple steps and we have specific sections, specific modules in your study guide, and the way a textbook is organized is considerable amount of detail regarding each phase. Okay. One part of phase 3 is also the acknowledgement of limitations. Now, in phase 1, there are several steps. Typically, those 5 steps which are delineated in your book are to select, formulate, and narrow the research question. You can't have a very broad research question. So if we ask a research question such as, a higher education leads to better career opportunities. Okay, it's a very complex question, and we will get into a little further. As we start to narrow that question down, and we do have a narrow answerable question, the next step in phase 1 is to choose a research design. And usually the selection of a research design means whether you choose a qualitative method or whether you choose a quantitative method. Regardless of whether you choose qualitative or quantitative methods, what we have to do is we have to design measures for variables. We have to then have tables for analysis of all the data that we collect. And finally, what we have to do is we have to set up a sample. So these are the steps, the principal 5 steps in phase 1. So let's go back to the question. If we say a higher education higher level of education leads to greater career opportunities, we have to make several decisions. Are we going to make this concept a little simpler? What do we mean by higher education? We need to define what we're talking about. Does it mean more years after high school? Does it mean more degrees? What does that mean? When we talk about career opportunities, we have to break that down as well, because are we saying these lead to careers with greater incomes or greater stability, and so on. So as you can see, we have to figure out how to formulate the question. Then to measure each of these things, we have to figure out a research design. Do we want anecdotal evidence to know what we want to know, or do we need numbers? And then what's going to change? What are we looking at that's going to change? And so on. So there's a lot to think about in phase 1 itself. First step in phase 1 is to focus and narrow the research problem. Right? So as we start to focus and narrow the research problem, there might be a complex question such as perhaps your interest is in studying the intersectionality of gender and poverty. So it might be quite complex. You may have a hunch that older women are much more impoverished in later life than older men. So you might want to ask a question, what is it like to be female and poor? Okay? And if you went about interviewing a bunch of older women whose economic circumstances are not favorable, but you get their personal insight as to why, how they feel that they don't have enough resources to live their daily lives, and it's an interview-based study, then that would be an example of qualitative research. However, if your interest was in finding out what percentage of Canadian families have significant disposable income, that would be the example of a quantitative research. So when you're focusing and narrowing the research problem itself, you need to have some clarity on what your question is or what you want to find out, because that's going to determine one of the future steps in phase one, which is the choice of a research design. As promised, this is where you choose a research design. And if you've defined your question well enough, it becomes quite obvious that you would choose a qualitative or quantitative method. The other thing about choosing a research design is while you're already picking qualitative or quantitative methodologies, you're going to have to figure out how you'll measure what it is that changes, because we need things that change to be observed and then for you to record those changes. Now, while you might measure variables in quantitative research, often in qualitative research what happens is you don't know what the variables are. You don't even know perhaps all of the concepts associated with a question of interest. And perhaps as the qualitative researcher starts the study and goes through the process, they start to identify the different concepts and different variables. So it's a little more complex than a traditional quantitative design, and we'll talk about it a little more in subsequent lectures. Even though there is no data collection in phase one, researchers need to have an analysis plan. So are we going to have data collection sheets? Are we going to have them stored in an Excel file? Are we going to graph this data, or is it just going to be in the form of tables? All these are decisions that must be taken by the researcher. And finally, what needs to occur is the process of sampling. So researchers have to decide what kind of sample it is that they wish to collect. Will they be collecting a random sample, a non-random sample, a sudden sample, and so on? Let's look at a quantitative example. If we think about activity and optimal aging, then our first steps are going to be, well, will the study have men and women? What might be the geographic region that we're going to collect our sample from? What is the age group we might be interested in? We're going to have to unpack the concept of activity, because it's a very broad concept, as you can tell. And we will also have to unpack the concept of optimal aging. What do we mean by optimal aging? And then in the first place, while we figure out all of this, this should help guide us to the research question. So what is the research question, or what is the hypothesis? So if we wanted to look at activity and optimal aging, perhaps we can have a hypothesis that women over 65 in Greater Sudbury, city of Greater Sudbury, are likely to report a better quality of life if engaged in 150 minutes or more every week, running out of space, in physical activity. But you get the point. So the question starts to get very, very defined, and we just took a quantitative example. And once you have the question defined that well, then it becomes easy for you to set up tables and to collect data. Now, the example I have is of a pretend table. When you start collecting data in quantitative research, oftentimes it is tabulated. So if we were to perceive older adults and we were to measure their perception of how they're aging, are they aging well? What do they think? If we had a scale of some sort, we could go ahead and conduct a survey pending ethical approval, and we pass these questionnaires that older adults can answer, where they respond to how many minutes of activity a week they're involved in and how they perceive their own aging. This is all pretend data, so again, this is not real. I just made this up. Once phase 2 is complete, this is phase 3. Data collection is all phase 2. This is phase 3, analysis and interpretations. Part of analysis and interpretation is being able to draw conclusions. Conclusions aren't just conclusions from your own data. It has to be related to not just the research question, it has to be related to the body of knowledge as a whole. So when we conduct research, we often do something called a literature review, which involves a comprehensive reading, understanding, and analysis of existing research that precedes our own work. It's literature review that helps us identify the gap in that subject area, which we hope to kind of fill a portion of with our own work. So the conclusion has to not just relate to the research question proposed, but it has to relate to the broader literature being presented as well. In the analysis and interpretation phase 3, the limitations of the study must be cited as well. Limitations are important. We'll talk about that in a couple more slides. Good researchers are often good enough to point out future steps that they might take or a fellow researcher might take moving forward. Take a couple of minutes now, maybe I would say 5 minutes. You can put the video on pause. Think about a research topic, something that interests you. And then what I would like you to do is to try to specify how this topic can be rephrased as a problem statement. Perhaps your interest is in asking how many students use research methods in their career? Or is a research methods career important to me in later life? Or perhaps you want to ask, what are the career opportunities for gerontology students? Whatever it is, think of a question and try to frame it in a measurable or answerable statement that can be further researched. Keep in mind, as a novice researcher, your research statement might not be quite as strong starting out, but that is something we will work on moving forward. Chapter 2 delves into something known as the disciplines of research. The disciplines of research, it has more to do with being disciplined about certain aspects of research itself. And creating a research question that is answerable, that's limited in scope, and that's really a portion of a large question. is the product of a disciplined researcher. So if you want to answer a question as to what factors affect or what factors influence older adults, so let's write this down. What factors influence an older adult's decision to choose a particular long-term care home? If you look at this question, it is broad and can be narrowed further, but it is definitely an answerable question because through an interview process, several concepts can be correlated to the decision itself. We might have to define what an older adult is, but most likely, if we pick an age range, 65 to 75, we can make that very, very specific. One of the key things about this is not only is the question narrow, it's actually going to lead to concepts with variables that can actually be uncovered through a qualitative research process. The key thing is it has a question that allows something that is researchable, something that's measurable. In contrast, if a research question does not identify a measurable, tangible piece of evidence, you can't really answer that question through research. So, for example, is Florida better than Arizona? To visit in winters? The reason you can't answer that question is these are very subjective viewpoints. Yes, you can poll people and get their opinion on what they think is better, but you really can't answer that. Or can you, if you have two artists arguing about whether the Mona Lisa is better than Van Gogh's paintings of the daffodils or whatever it is, these are non-researchable questions. The next thing that your chapter 2 talks about is the need for honesty and accuracy. It goes without saying that we're all taught to be honest growing up as children, and honesty is important. But in research, honesty assumes both honesty and accuracy because reporting something inaccurately, inaccuracy does not mean dishonesty. Inaccuracy is not equal to dishonesty. But there are problems in either situation. If you're not honest in your research and your research reporting, your information becomes useless. It's not usable because you're not honest. The data coming out, the conclusions coming out are not true. The same comes out of inaccuracy. If you've been sloppy or if you have sloppy students reporting the data, recording the data, and you get to some conclusions, it's not accurate. So the usability of the information, it just becomes garbage. You can't use it. The other thing about being honest to yourself as a scientist and being accurate is one should never selectively use data to fit theory. Now, when you start to decide the result before you've asked the research question and collected data to support or refute it, you shouldn't be collecting data to support or refute. You should collect the data to follow the research question, and then the data will tell you whether your hypothesis is true or not. But there have been enough scientists in the past, due to financial pressures or due to the need for recognition, have chosen data to fit their theory. The consequences are obviously pretty bad because it's fraudulent in the first place, and the second thing is it causes a lot of confusion where research is supposed to provide clarity. We'll talk about a very specific example where data was used to fit theory. In the 60s, there were several studies indicating that cultures that had diets rich in saturated fat had a very high incidence of cardiovascular events, so heart attacks and strokes. Um, Now, the problem with these earlier studies was they were ignoring cultures that did consume a lot of high fat diets and actually did not suffer from any cardiovascular diseases. So data was cherry picked. Another example that is more prominent is the study done on vaccines causing autism. Now, this study was done by a scientist called Wakefield, and what Wakefield was a physician in the United States, probably still is a physician in the United States. Him and his team of fellow physicians, they interviewed a very small subset of the population of individuals whose children had autism and who had answered affirmatively to their child's physiology changing after taking the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. Anyway, the point is the scientists demonstrated in their paper, so to speak, that the vaccines caused autism. This was fraudulent science because they had already decided that this was the answer, and they cherry-picked individuals to support their claims. So there are, and the challenge with all of this is, in the U.S., as a result, this gave strength to a whole swath of people who believed that vaccination was the cause of all kinds of later life miseries for themselves and their children. Unfortunately, this also resulted in a lot of people avoiding vaccinations and thereby their children getting violently ill, sick, or even dying. So there are consequences for dishonesty. The final discipline that your chapter 2 talks about is record keeping. Record keeping is important because records allow us to go back to work that was done. Records also allow others following our notes to come to the same conclusion when they go through steps. It's a question of transparency. So we want research to be transparent because that's what gives it credibility, and that's why it can genuinely be seen as knowledge. So anybody following the research notes or research methods or research papers can arrive to the same exact conclusions by looking at the data. I was not accurate in stating that that was the last discipline. The last discipline is citing limitations. So every research project has limitations. Good researchers must not overstate findings. As we mentioned earlier, a research question, like a slice of a pizza, is meant to answer a fraction, a fragment of the larger research question. Claiming that a research result or the product of a research project answers much more than it really does. It shows negligence on part of the researcher. It also sets other people up to believe that if they aren't diligent enough and assume truths that do not exist. Limitations are good because they also lend a context to the research. So it makes people think about what still needs to be discovered and so on. It allows for follow-up. It allows for true expansion of knowledge. So this is important. Now we segue into two concepts that Chapter 2 introduces to. The first is called theory. Theory is, we often say, I have a theory that Mark loves Lisa, or I have a theory that Mark has a crush on Lisa. Okay? I have a theory that once these kids are done their snacks, they will be out of our hair. So we often use the word theory quite freely. And a theory is a guess. A theory is a hunch. I have a theory that an 8:30 a.m. class is too early for several students. It's basically a feeling, a hunch. It's a statement that tries to connect two different concepts. It's a simple sentence, and you're trying to say that one is related to the other. Not necessarily one causes the other, but one is associated with the other. That's what a theory is. Data, on the other hand, is the evidence that shows the connection between two ideas that you've connected with a theory. For example, early morning class equals low attendance. Two different concepts: time of the day, class attendance. Okay? So a theory would relate that, but data would be the actual numbers. Well, a class at 8:30 a.m., number of students in class. Okay? So that would be a relationship that you'd have to collect, and that's what the data would be. So data is basically evidence or pieces of evidence. There are data available for both qualitative research and quantitative research. The data in qualitative research tends to be descriptive, so it's often interviews, it's conversations that are taped, sometimes video films, sometimes text material as well. So this is pretty much what's covered in Chapter 2, and if you've read the chapter, go through the module in the study guide. What I'd suggest is for you to read the chapter in its entirety, and once you've read the chapter, solve every question at the back of the chapter. This is how you will get your concepts solid, and you will be able to complete all the assignments successfully. And if your instructor decides on a final exam, you will be well prepared for it without having to cram at the last minute. So let's review. Why do we undertake research? To create knowledge, to make a decision, to settle debate. Right? These are the three reasons. There are probably more reasons you can find in a textbook, but you should at least be able to answer these. Why do we consider research a process? So when you think about research, the reason it is a process is that it is a series of linked activities. So it's a bunch of different activities, no matter who you are, what kind of research question you have. You have to go through the series of linked activities from beginning to end. And that's why it's a process. Any process is a bunch of steps that you do to get from point A to point B. The normal process, or the normal sequence of a research process, is the three phases. So phase 1 is the essential first steps. Phase 2 is data collection and organization of data and literature. And phase 3 is analysis and interpretation. All research goes through these steps. What are the essential first steps? So if you have read Chapter 2 by now, you know what the essential first steps are. Select and narrow a research design and select and narrow and formulate a question. That would be a first step. Then you would choose a research design based on your question. You would then select and devise variables, things that vary, and how you would measure them. So select and devise variables and measures. Then you would determine how you would save all that information. So you would create perhaps tables for analysis. And finally, you would choose where your data is coming from, or you would choose a sample. Why are they important? Well, the first steps are important because if you don't do the first essential steps properly, the continuation of the project may become very difficult or even impossible moving forward. What is done in phase 2 of a research project? Well, phase 2, you collect data and you get organized. You organize all the data and you organize your bibliography. Hopefully, by the time you get to this place, you already organized your bibliography and literature, because without that, you can't really ask the right research question or select variables and measures and how research design and all of those things. But at least this is your organization step. The 4 disciplines of the research project are 4 things that you have to be disciplined in. Obviously, you need accuracy, you You need honesty, you need record keeping, you need to be able to cite limitations. Most importantly, number one, you need to come up with a researchable question. Okay? And I can't remember if there's anything else. But we went through that and go through your textbook. There are four disciplines that you have to remember. Okay? Major properties of research question is the question should be focused, narrow in scope, and must have measurables that you can measure, that you can observe and measure. Theory and data. Well, as you remember, theory is a statement that connects to concepts, and data is evidence of change or evidence, or fragments of evidence that you can get to answer your research question. Two major kinds of research are qualitative and quantitative research. This is pretty much it for the lecture component of Module 1-2 or Chapter 2. So, like I said, go ahead, finish up reading a chapter, go through the module, complete your assignment. I believe you have your first assignment in Chapter 2, and we will see you in Lecture 3.